It's about belonging. It's about community. In that case, this story I was beginning to tell about Billy, he is now in prison. Having been groomed, he became a mule in a gang, etc., etc. He was commanded to carry a knife, all sorts of things. But he's now in a youth detention centre.
Welcome to Care Vision's Professional Talk, the discussion show that brings you vital insights from leading voices in social care, education, health, and youth development. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, and I speak to trailblazers, researchers, and practitioners. And for all of those interested in how we care within our society, come join us. Whether you're a practitioner, educator, family member, or curious learner, join us to think, reflect, and grow new ideas. Hello, I'm Humphrey Hawksley. This is Care Vision's Professional Talk, and my guest is a remarkable figure whose work he sums up quite simply: to build a house for children who have no one to care for them, a school that can prepare them for the rough and tumble of life, and a hospital for when they're in need. He founded the Oasis Charitable Trust in 1985 and now works in some of Britain's poorest communities. And before I say any more, welcome Steve Chalke to Care Vision's Professional Talk.
Thank you, Humphrey. Thank you. I feel welcomed. Thank you.
It's great to have you here, Steve. And 40 years almost you've been on this. The plight of vulnerable children in Britain, has it got better or worse over those past 40 years?
Sadly, it's getting worse. And in actual fact, that was a serious conversation I had yesterday with some main funders into charitable work amongst children, just that all the figures are slipping backwards. Everything that should be moving forwards isn't. There are a growing number of children living in poverty, and the gap between the rich and the poor is growing all the time. So we see in children from poor backgrounds a vastly greater percentage of persistently absent children from school, or even children that are off-rolled altogether, excluded, who are school refusers. And you've got to ask, why is that figure growing all of the time? It's very worrying. There's lots said about it in Parliament and in the media, but what are we going to do about it? In fact, I'm off to talk to government just later today about exactly those issues.
Good, because that's the next point that I wanted to raise, is that in your, talking to me and in your website and everything, you talk very much about a community, and you say that programs don't create change. And we hear from politicians all the time, we're putting X million into this program and X million into that program. He says, but belonging, acceptance, and the creation of communities create the change. Just explain what you mean by that.
Well, I think often it's not that the money's bad. Of course, we need money to build community, to create healthy community, but it's who the money is delivered to and how it's used that makes the difference. And very often, a big funding pot is announced either by government or some huge charitable corporation, and the money goes to the people that can fill the best forms in, who can make the best application. And the people that can make the best applications are usually people who don't live in the community. So in actual fact, this whole professional setup of organising and helping communities leaves the very communities they're designed to help out, who don't get a voice.
So how would that turn around?
By investing in local people. You know, there's that saying, isn't there? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And often local communities aren't at the table. They're not consulted on what's actually going on here. How do we make this contextually relevant to this local community and its needs? Instead, professionals gather around the table and they discuss the community who are on the menu, not seated at the table. So it's an easy thing to reverse. We all say it takes a village to raise a child. I mean, there can't be a person on planet Earth who speaks English that's not heard that statement. It takes a village to raise a child. But normally, as I often say, we do that just before we leave the village out entirely, because we believe professionals who don't live in the community have got a much better view of how to do things than the people that do live there and know the streets.
Give me a picture of a community, because we're hearing this word a lot. But almost one of those words that we hear and people assume we know what it means without necessarily knowing what it means. And also, how is a community different from that other word we keep hearing, a silo, which we hear on social media, where people just go to the like-minded view so they don't get challenged? A community is different to that, isn't it?
Yeah, because when I use the term community, I'm talking about a locality, a neighborhood, a hood. I'm talking about a small geographical area where people know each other. The word community gets used in various different ways, though. So we talk about the community of commuters traveling up on a train to London or whatever. We talk about community in all sorts of ways. And that's when community tends to become that homogenous thing, which is about people who share a viewpoint on life or an output on life, or come from the same kind of socio-economic structure.
But a community, there's lots of different viewpoints and types of people that all have to get on together.
In a local community, it's people next door neighbours, people on the street, people round the corner. It's people who run the local school, who run the local GPs. It's people who run the local darts club or dance club or tea club or football club. So it's people who are actually the poor. It's people that are left out and actually have no voice. It's the young and the old, and they know their situation. Of course, they need support and help in that, but it's about giving them agency. And so often, our formality robs the very people that we should be listening to of formality. I was in a meeting just like a few days ago, actually. It was an extraordinary meeting, and it was all about life on some tough inner London council estates. And at one point in the meeting, I asked everybody if they'd ever visited any of those council estates that we'd spent an hour discussing. It was a good, open conversation, and everybody confessed they'd never visited them.
Except for you.
I said, have you ever walked past them? Do you have a friend who lives on any council estate anywhere in the country? Still no one, everybody laughed, but they didn't. I said, have you ever been for a meal with somebody who lives in one of these communities that you're so intent on lifting into a different place? No one had ever had a meal there. So in other words, this particular group of people, mostly Oxbridge educated, wonderful people, not knocking them, who really passionately cared because of the doctrine of equality, were committed to doing something, but hadn't actually asked anybody who was in that situation what they needed and what they wanted.
Well, are they that wonderful then, Steve, if that's their career or profession and they don't go and do the walking through, the doorstepping, the talking to people?
Well, I sometimes think, Humphrey, it's become a little bit of our culture, or a cultural disease, hasn't it? Where the academics, and I'm not knocking anyone, get detached from reality. They say that the further away the policy is created, the research is created from the community that it's or the people group that it's designed to serve, the more irrelevant it's likely to be. The gap between the policy and the practice is often the problem.
Now, you and I first worked together, must be 20 years or so ago, on child slavery in the cocoa industry in West Africa. And I remember it well. And I met the children, you met the children there that grew up in these very traumatized circumstances. What is the common ground between those children and the ones that you encounter in poverty in Britain, and what are their differences?
Well, I think that that the common ground is exploitation. When we talk about modern slavery, And of course, when we were talking about West Africa and the cocoa trade, we were talking about modern slavery, the enslavement of people to produce cocoa beans very cheaply for our Western markets, with all the profit in that chain being made by the producers, et cetera, but very little of it going back to sometimes people who receive no wage at all except a meal a day. The same thing happens on our streets. When we talk about modern slavery in this country, young people in poorer communities are extraordinarily prone to being enslaved, trapped in gangs, drugs gangs, gangs that steal phones, etc., which is all a product of serious organised crime. So the gang in this community and the gang in that community and the gang in another community, the leaders are only pawns themselves in a much bigger chain, which is all about national and sometimes international organised crime. I was hearing the story just the other day in a different setting of a lad called Billy just the other night. I'm sure his name had been changed. But Billy found himself living on a housing estate in North London, and his father died and his mum was distressed and he was alone and she didn't have the emotional space for him. And he sat on the estate where he was crying one night, just on a wall, I think. And somebody came up to him and befriended him and offered to buy him a meal. And they were kind to him. And you can tell where this story is going, can't you?
And he goes to the same place as the kids in West Africa would. So the psychology of the child, if that's the right word, in the ones in Britain that you're doing, when the trauma comes in, when the damage comes in, when they, how do you stop a child becoming too damaged in this situation?
Well, I think it all comes back to what you said at the beginning. It's about belonging. It's about community. In that case, this story I was beginning to tell about Billy, he is now in prison. Having been groomed, he became a mule in a gang, etc., etc. He was commanded to carry a knife, all sorts of things. But he's now in a youth detention centre because of what happened to him. But what was missing was a sense of belonging. In his moment of grief, when his mum was dealing with her grief, there was no one for him. There was no youth club for him. There was no youth worker. There was no football club. There was nothing there for him. And his school didn't have the capacity to listen, the resource to listen. In our society, when anything goes wrong or we're troubled about the use of social media, for instance, by kids, we immediately say, what's the school doing about it? Well, a child only spends just under 20% of their year in school. If they go every day, they never skip, they're never ill, they're never late, and they never leave early and turn up at every breakfast club available. They still spend under 20% of their year in school. We need community to wrap itself around them, and that's our great loss. So let's fund the local people and the communities.
The youth clubs, the football clubs, the darts clubs, that sort of thing. So let's stick with Billy for a moment. He is now in prison, although if he had had a chance of those people who sat around the table with from Oxford and Cambridge, he probably would not be in prison. You say the community, you get the community going. Do you ask for the money for this and it goes somewhere else? I mean, you talked about it, but
yeah. So part of the role that I play and Oasis plays is to get funding, and not for our own use, but for local community groups. of course, we need money for our own use. We run lots of schools, for instance. We run lots of housing. But we, I should say, are now involved in several huge projects where we simply act as a broker for everyone else, an organizer for everyone else. You know what typically happens, time and time again, I can't believe there's anybody that's going to be listening to us talking who doesn't know a similar story. What happens is a child is dyslexic and really struggles at school, or they're on the autistic spectrum, etc., or they get wrapped up in violence of some sort, and their mum, their dad, their family, distraught at what's happened to their son or their daughter, determine they're going to set up a little group to work with children in the local school, or to set up a little local club of some sort. And so they get on with it. And so a little foundation, a local foundation, a little local charity is born that has huge local knowledge and lots of trust in the community. But they can't get funded. Why? Because they can't produce 3 years of financial results for big funders, because they haven't got the right governance structure in place, because they don't understand audits, because they don't understand governance structures. Why should they? These are wonderful people who are loved in a community. And what our job is to support them. And that's going back to what I say, when a little local group applies for cash, they just can't compete with the big professional charities who've got banks of fundraisers sitting there who can fill in perfect forms but don't know the community, and often will move into the community, displacing all those local groups and making them feel useless and unwanted until the cash runs out, the funding's gone, and then the project's pulled, and then the community's in a worse state than it was before, because the local people have been disempowered again, and they're scrambling around to do what they could have done sustainably with a little bit of help and a little bit of support, rather than professionals arriving who think they know better. The problem is that the systems we set up are formal, aren't they? You formally apply for a grant. You fill in this form. Yeah. It has to be in by this deadline. You go for interview. It's all about people who are articulate and have the resources within themselves to do this. But the issue is that communities are informal. They're brilliant at doing what they do, but they're not so good at ticking the boxes and filling in the forms.
Yeah, I can see your passion. You were even getting me angry there. Your passion there, Steve. And you've been doing this for such a long time, with the equal passion when we worked together before. But how did you get into? I mean, why didn't you become a banker or an airline pilot or an astronaut or something?
Well, I went to the kind of school where I never had a careers lesson from the day at secondary school. Well, through my entire this entire school process. I went to a lovely primary school, but then I failed the 11 plus, and I went to a secondary school where there was no career guidance. I mean, actually, when we were asked what we wanted to be, we all used to say we wanted to be a draftsman. Nobody had a clue what a draftsman was, but we had one friend whose dad was a draftsman, and he was the kid who had the poshest clothes. So we felt that, wow, whatever a draftsman does, they must earn enough money for our friend John to wear these clothes. So that's what he did. So we all said we wanted to be draftsmen, but we were never given any guidance at all. But my salvation, if you like, came through a local youth group at a church that I started going to, because there was a girl that I fancied, and her name was Mary. She was beautiful. She still is beautiful. I still know her, though I'm not married to her. And Mary was 15, I was 14. I went along on Friday nights. I was going nowhere really and not doing well at education. And I went just to ogle at Mary every Friday night, who'd stand at the other end of the hall, because the girls always stood at one end and the boys up the other end, and nobody ever talked to one another. We played table tennis, that kind of thing. And then one night she sent her best friend across, who was called Carol. to me to tell me that she would never go out with me because she thought I was ugly, which was teenagers can be brutal, but I think being ogling at her for so long, I probably made her feel really uncomfortable over the weeks. And so I wandered home that night, and a short walk home, and I thought, I'm never going back to that youth club because it's embarrassing now because Mary thinks I'm ugly. And then this great realization came over me that the story they told at that little church youth club, in which they used to do epilogues and things like that. So one of the leaders would talk for a few minutes, tell a story. But I'd got the gist that what they were saying is that your life matters. You're made by God and your life really matters. You have huge potential. Mm-hmm. Whereas down at my school, they told me the opposite. I didn't have very much potential at all. I'd work in a factory for the rest of my life. They told us all that. And so I remember the moment when I thought, I'm going to go back to that youth club, even if Mary doesn't fancy me, because the church youth club story is much better than story they tell me at the school. So I decided to go back. And then I thought, still on this little 5 minute, 6-7 minute walk home. So if that's true, I'm going to be a Christian because I think that's the story that they believe I'm going to be, because it sounds like a good story. I'll be a Christian. Therefore, I ought to become a church leader eventually, because it was a strange thing. I decided I'd be a church leader and I would set up a school that was worth going to, because mine wasn't, a house for kids to live who'd never been loved. I had friends like that. Yeah. Who were, fostered and pushed around all over the place, but never felt love. And that showed in their behaviour. And I could work that out even at the age of 14. And good health care. So on that little trip home, I left the youth club not having a clue what to do with my life. I arrived home and I had that gift of direction.
In 7 minutes, you had worked out the mission statement, for want of a better word, that you're operating on today. And it was part of the community as well. That youth club was the community that you said is being ripped apart at the moment.
It was the local community, which is why it was only a 5-7 minute walk home. And I went the next week to that youth club. That was a voluntary community youth club. It was just run by the community for the community. And I told them my story, and they gave me a load of help. And that was when I was 14. By the time I was 15, they put me on the stage at the little local youth club to do my first talk. So I actually did one of these epilogues. It was a strange thing because it took me I remember I'd read a book with a yellow cover. I can't remember what it was called. And I read it through and I worked on this talk and I did loads of notes, etc. It was going to be great. And I stood up and I did my whole big talk that I've been preparing for a week, and it lasted about 2.5 minutes. And that was the end. And at the age of 15, by the local community, I was given the opportunity to stand up and speak publicly. And, now from time to time, well, in fact, actually, just yesterday, I did a coaching session on somebody who had to make a big public speech, and they didn't, so they went through their speech with me. And I said, throw away your notes, your notes, because it's in your heart, let your heart sing.
Get it out.
Yeah, your eyes are what matter. Your hands are what matters. Yeah. Your expression and your tone. Oh, well, I'll lose some of the detail, they said. I said, don't bother. I said, you remember all those really boring politicians who are bound to their script? They get every detail in, but they never make contact with people because they never look up.
You've got to get them to love you. Yeah, that's...
Yeah. So I did this session, and actually they rang me just a little while ago to say, they rang me just this morning. And they said, oh, Steve, I took your advice. And it was like fantastic. And their friends had been with them and said, you were brilliant. It was like you were a different person. And I said, no, you were you for the first time. So I've learned to speak, and I often coach people in public speaking, in communications and media and things like that. But that's all because I was given that opportunity by my local community. I trade on my communications skills, or more bluntly, as my family would say, I can just rap it on for a long time.
But
I trade on that every day. but it came from the community.
Okay. And when did you, the other thing, the manifesto of hope and your hope in the desert of life, was that same 7-minute walk, or did that come several years later?
Oh, well, the manifesto for hope is the most recent book I've written. But it all grew out of the same thing because I remember I eventually became a youth worker for a church for a little while before setting up Oasis, and was running all of these youth projects. It was a huge youth club, if you like, with lots of stuff going on and probably 150 kids involved. And somebody asked me to write a book about youth work. Well, I hadn't got a clue how to write. Remember, I'd failed everything at school. And they said, we'd like 80,000 words. I'm like, 80,000 words? Like, I don't even know 80,000 words. But they gave me some advice, and I wrote this text. It took me a long time, but I wrote this text, and the book got published. It was really successful. And then they asked me to do another one. And, and so I've written probably 50, 60 books now, et cetera, et cetera. But I always write about the core things I believe in. And the Manifesto of Hope it's a whole project, not just a book, but it's a project about how we create opportunity for every child, young person, and their family in this country, which again comes back down to the things we've been talking about.
And then how do you, the hope that that we all have in this all sounds good, and when the politicians say it all sounds good, but you've touched on the obstacles of getting it to work. And you told the story of Billy, very graphically. How does that hope actually translate into logistics?
Well, I think that hope has to be tangible. One of the things I say, by the way, I'm not anti-politician at all. I'm really not. And I realize they're in a machine and they're in a system, and they struggle with their own powerlessness in that system very often. But one of the things I say very often, because I realized it's true, talking about the most recent crop of politicians, the Labour Party, when Labour were campaigning a couple of years ago, they used the same song as they used when Tony Blair was campaigning, which was the Dream song. Things can only get better. I'm sure you know it, but things can only get better. And I was speaking at an event for some politicians all in power at the moment, and I said, things can only get better. I mean, it's just not true, is it? I said,
well, you told me at the beginning they've actually got worse.
Yeah,
and that's through Blair and through this and through all the various machinations.
Things got worse. So I said, when you say things can only get better, you don't even believe it yourself. Things can get worse, and often they do get worse. So we have to not just offer a piece of empty optimism, which is what great tune, but it's an empty optimism song. What we've got to do is offer something tangible and real, and that requires strategies and models and hard work. Let's make this thing work in this community. And as we make this thing work here, we create a model that can be shared, not because it's a great academic principle full of wonderful theories, but because it's real and you can go and see the people and visit it and copy it. That's what we have to do. And in my view, hope isn't airy-fairy. It's not empty optimism. Hope is ferocious. Hope is hard. Hope is demanding. Hope requires a lot of us. Hope is a warrior.
Yeah, so hope is one, but the Care Visions deals with children's homes and foster homes. So these are the children, I suspect, that haven't made it through your neighborhoods or your communities or something like that. I mean, you gave us a very good idea of Billy. Just give us an idea of a child that you might see in one of the places you're working that could fall through these cracks
well, absolutely. In fact, this very week, yesterday, last time, I'm getting engaged in a conversation about how we create children's homes alongside our schools. because so many kids do fall through the gap. And when they fall through the gap, often they end up being shunted around in foster care because foster care is difficult and there's not enough support for it. And as I'm sure you know, there are not enough foster carers stepping forward. If you are removed from your birth parents, when you're a week old, when you're a few months old, you stand a much higher percentage chance of being adopted. The older you get when you're taken away or removed by social services from your birth parent or your birth parents, the less likelihood there is that you'll be adopted and the more likelihood that you'll be fostered. But fostering is really tough work. So how do we support foster carers? And the older you get, the harder that gets. So what we need is a new generation of children's homes as well, and supported housing for children over the age of 16. Now,
and they will be geographically next to the school, so the community is still there.
Yes,
the same people are there. Yeah,
yeah. And at the moment, I'm working on three new schemes. We run quite a lot of supported housing around the country, but I'm working on three schemes, all of which are in areas where we don't actually run schools, but where we've been able to acquire houses. And so our task, one is a children's home for under 16 children. One is a supported housing for over 16. So this would be kids in Key Stage 5, at college or at school doing A-levels or vocational qualifications. And then the third one is going to be, we plan to open all of these next year. We got the premises, we're working on the plans, we've got most of the finance to do it. So we've got someone working on it full-time alongside me. In fact, I'm going to see them later today. So we aim to get all three of these places open next year. And what they will do, well, the first two, the children's home and the supported housing for over 16, they will work alongside schools in the area. So not Oasis schools, we run almost 60 schools ourselves, but these aren't for children for our schools. These will be a resource for schools in the areas where we're working. And the one which is for children on remand, it means that they don't get, often children are placed on remand for a serious crime, often which never comes to court because the case falls away, etc. At the moment, they often end up inside a secure establishment, a YOI.
This is what's happened to Billy, is it? That he's...
Yeah. A young...
into that, yeah. And he's in the prison system, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a youth offender, a young offenders institution, like Feltham, which is a very famous one everybody's heard of. But sometimes somebody's placed on remand there for a few weeks before, 60% of cases where a child is placed on remand, then that case never comes to court, so they're released. So we're setting up a house for them as well, where we can continue their education and nurture them back into it. So, children's housing is a very important thing. And to tell you the truth, government's thinking hard about this. But, what government needs are people who are in the ring, in the fight, who run with some pilot models. That's what happens.
As opposed to your Oxbridge academics that are foreign. I want to bring in Danny Henderson now from Care Visions, because they're very much on the front line of this, to get his view on what you've been saying. But just to sum up, not sum up, but just to say, Steve, you've got a project to try to build children's homes next to the schools in the community. Also a separate but linked project for remand centres that would stop the young people actually coming face to face with the prison system. Yeah. And it would cushion them from that. And this whole idea of creating communities. Danny, you've been listening to that. What do you think?
There's a lot there, isn't there? Steve, I'm fascinated by Billy's story. It's a story. I've worked in residential childcare in various roles for more than 30 years, and it's all throughout my adult life, really. Billy's story is really familiar to me. And it raises some questions about what we might do to stop young people who are victims of circumstance, victims of exploitation, victims of poverty, to stop them from becoming perpetrators. And one of the kind of dissatisfactions, I think, across the systems, whether it's in Scotland or England or other parts of the world, is on the one hand, we're looking to nurture development, we're looking to nurture some sort of recovery for young people that need that. But they get to a certain stage in life where that job's maybe not done or half done. And young people hit the criminal justice system, the youth justice system, then the criminal justice system, and the kind of ethical dimensions to that, the ideological dimensions to that, the kind of almost archaic dimensions of how we treat people who've committed crimes, who might be a risk to others or risks to themselves. It feels like a really, quite a collision for those young people. And I wonder if you've any thoughts on criminal justice reform, youth justice reform, and how that might kind of better match our aspirations that we have for inclusion, for recovery, and for hope for these young people.
Well, Danny, I think you're absolutely right. And as you say, Billy's story is told 1,000 times, isn't it? Thousands of times. And not just boys. Is this happening to girls at the same time as well, in all sorts of ways? Well, I think that what we talk about very often is, these are offenders and we lock them up. I often say that I once saw a headline in one of the red top papers a bit like this. I can't remember it, and I wish I'd have kept the cut. Yeah, I'd have kept it. But the headline was effectively something like 12-year-old thug arrested for drug running. It was a local paper, 12-year-old thug arrested for drug running. And I often, even then, but often since reflecting on, why didn't it say 12-year-old child rescued from drug gang, which would be more accurate. So we have this very negative view of kids that get involved in crime. It's their own fault. Why should they have a second chance? Just lock them up. And I often say, they don't need a second chance, they need a first chance. They've never been given a first chance, is what you're saying, Danny. And so we're involved in the criminal justice system as well. We're responsible for something which is called Oasis Restore, which is something I campaigned for a long, long time for, and others as well. But I first got involved in campaigning for this in 2010. We opened it in 2014, and it is the country's first what's called a secure school. So it's a therapeutic alternative to a youth jail, to a youth offending a young offenders institution. There is some great therapeutic practice, as you know, in the justice system, but Oasis Restore is built therapeutically. It's, the whole plan is therapeutic. The design of the buildings, the colours on the wall, the furniture, the setup. There are no cells, there are bedrooms. There are no wards or wings. There are student flats. There are students. There are no guards with jangling keys or iron doors. There are youth workers and teachers and health workers. So everything about the place and the training of everyone in the place is therapeutic because all behaviour, as I don't need to tell you, Danny, I know you know this, all behaviour is communication. I often joke, my wife says, the more stressed I am, the more stupidly I behave. And
so it's about security. I mean, what you're offering there is a sense of community and security.
Yes, exactly.
And being nice to each other instead of being punished. Danny, has Care Visions, followed any of these sort of elements that Steve's talked about, the care homes next to the schools, the cushion against the justice system?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there is really good intent within the system, and the system is populated by some great people. I think to some extent, some of the efforts that Steve makes, that we make in relation to sort of actually helping young people, it becomes difficult through some political kind of dichotomies, really. That nobody wants more crime, but actually how we, or youth offending, but how we address youth offending actually almost kind of is at odds with restoration and recovery and rehabilitation. So the best thing that we can do for young people is form caring relationships with them, show them that we really care for them. And that sounds simple, but it's not simple when it's young people that are suspicious of adults in authority. That young people are kind of cynical, to say the least, about the ability. The people who have tried to help them before that might have failed. They'll also have been exploited by people through the vulnerability. So that's much more difficult than it seems. But what we're trying to do through those relationships is engage them in a modular relationship through which they learn to trust the world and meet their needs in a way that means that they don't have to act defensively within the world, or and can engage more widely within a network, within a social network, within a community. So community starts to some extent at that birth or that rebirth of trust in relationships with one person in the first instance. Then we extend upon that. So within residential childcare, there is an extent to which maybe there's a perception that children and young people are siloed, but what we try and do is make sure that they're not siloed, make sure that they're open, and that they have access to family, they have access to community, they have access to friendships, and try and sort of reduce the extent to which those experiences displace a network of support, because we can make judgments as professionals about individuals within families and the suitability of some communities, as you described earlier, Steve. But that is the where children and young people will return to as adults, even if they've spent their whole childhood within a system that's taken them away from that.
Yeah, it's the trust. Is Billy trusting people more now, Steve?
I don't know, because I don't know. I don't know the end of his story. I don't know where he is now. But I do know, exactly as Dan has just said, trust is expensive. It requires time. It requires relationship. It requires a young person not being a number in the system, but an individual who's understood, who's seen and comes to feel safe and secure because of the relationship. I mean, the thing I was saying earlier about, my wife saying that, the more stressed I am, the more stupidly I behave. I mean, that's true of us all. And the young people that Dan is talking about, they are stressed. They are hypervigilant. It's not when they flip, when they become dysregulated, because Danny said it's tough business building relationships and care and trust with these kids. They've never trusted anyone, and quite rightly, they've not trusted anyone because they've always been let down and hurt. So this takes time. Therapeutic care takes time, but. We say that this kid was doing well and then he went from 0 to 100 and he exploded. But he's not gone from 0 to 100. He's always stressed. He's always vigilant. And he's always running at 95%. And then he gets tipped over and then he gets punished for that. So we have to understand, and the thing I'd add to what Danny said, I absolutely agree with what Danny said. What we're doing at the moment doesn't work. So it's a waste of money. Our prisons are full, people reoffend, it's costing us a fortune, and it doesn't make our streets safer. So instead of locking people up and throwing away the key until they pull themselves up by their own bootstraps or whatever it might be, what we've got to say is it doesn't work. Instead of being tougher on crime, we ought to be smarter about it, and being smarter about it means deploying the kind of strategies Danny's just been talking about.
I think that what a brilliant discussion. And actually, I have to quote those child slaves that we worked on, Steve. I remember that when they were going back to their families, they were terrified. But when I interviewed them or met them in an NGO, in a charity that was looking after them and sending to school, you couldn't stop them talking. They were out there playing and they were happy and they were being kids again. So it took some time for the editors at the BBC to understand that being reunited with the family wasn't exactly the solution to the situation that they were in. But time's winged chariot, his attacks, we've got to end. Steve, thanks so much for sharing your stories, making us understand far more about the vulnerability of children, the strength of the community around them. But before you go, give us a one-line thought to take away from this Care Vision professional talk about what we've been talking about.
Well, I don't know if it's one line, but I don't know if you used to watch the A-Team on telly on Saturday evenings. Here's the thing, there is no A-Team. There's no one coming to sort this out for us. It's us. It's us. That's why we have to fight. We are responsible for one another. We have to build community.
Love it. Danny, you agree with that?
I do.
Brilliant. Danny, thanks so much. Steve, thank you so much for it. I love that last thought. For any comments, questions, challenges, please get in touch with Professional Talk at carevisions.co.uk or contact Steve and his team directly through www.oasisuk.org. That's oasisuk.org, and you can find out all about his work there. Until the next one, stay safe and goodbye.
Bye.
To hear more episodes, discover upcoming discussions, or access free tools and resources, scroll down to the episode description for all the links. And from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and all at Care Visions, stay safe and goodbye.